This is section 3.1, part A, explanatory and response variables. So far, we have only examined one variable statistics. Most statistical studies examine data on more than one variable. Fortunately, analysis of several variable data builds on the tools we use to examine individual variables. The principles that guide our work also remain the same. You should plot the data, then add numerical summaries. Look for the overall patterns and deviations from those patterns. And when there's a regular overall pattern, use a simplified model to describe it. We think that vehicle weights help explain accident deaths and that smoking influences life expectancy. In these relationships, the two variables play different roles. Accident death rate and life expectancy are the response variables of interest. Vehicle weight and number of cigarettes smoked are the explanatory variables. So a response variable measures an outcome of a study, while an explanatory variable helps explain or influence change in a response variable. You will often see explanatory variables called independent variables and response variables called dependent variables. Because the word independent and dependent have other meanings in statistics, we are not going to be using those terms. It is easiest to identify explanatory and response variables when we actually specify values of one variable to see how it affects another variable. To study the effects of alcohol on body temperature, researchers gave several different amounts of alcohol to mice. Then they measured the change in each mouse's body temperature 15 minutes later. The amount of alcohol is the explanatory variable. The change in the body temperature is the response variable. When we don't specify the values of either variable, but just observe both variables, there may or may not be explanatory and response variables. Whether there are depends on how you plan to use the data. So let's look at an example. Julie asked, "Can I predict a state's mean SAT score if I know its mean SAT critical reading score?" Jim wants to know how the mean SAT math and the critical reading scores this year in the 50 states are related to each other. So for each of these students, we need to identify the explanatory and the response variables. So if we look at Julie wants to know if the mean SAT math score, if she can predict it based on knowing the SAT critical reading score. So she knows the critical reading score, and then she wants to predict the math score. So in this case, the explanatory variable for Julie is the SAT critical reading score, while the response variable is the SAT math score. We want to see if their critical reading score is going to affect what their math score is. Jim is simply interested in exploring the relationship between the two variables, so there is no clear explanatory or response variable. In many studies, the goal is to show that changes in one or more explanatory variable actually causes change in a response variable. However, other explanatory response relationships do not involve direct causation. In the alcohol in mice study, the alcohol actually causes a change in body temperature. In the SAT math and critical reading score, the scores are closely related, but one score doesn't cause the other score. We can still use the state's mean SAT critical reading score to predict its mean math score. So let's identify the explanatory and response variables in each setting. How does drinking beer affect the level of alcohol in our blood? The legal limit for driving in all states is 0.08%. In a study, adult volunteers drank different numbers of cans of beer. 30 minutes later, the police officers measured their blood alcohol level. So the number of cans of beer will affect what the blood alcohol level is. So that means the explanatory variable is the number of beers, and the response variable is the blood alcohol level. The National Student Loan Survey provides data on the amount of debt for recent college graduates, their current income, and how stressed they feel about college debt. A sociologist looks at the data with the goal of using amount of debt and income to explain the stress caused by college debt. In this case, we actually have two explanatory variables. They think their amount of debt and how much income they have will explain the stress level that the college students have. So the two explanatory variables are amount of debt and current income, and the response variable is the amount of stress.